If I can have your attention, we're going to go ahead and get started. If I can have your attention, we're going to go ahead and get started. I love all the networking and all the conversation. That's what we implore and we enjoy about this Founders Lunch that we have. So we will continue that after the presentation, but thank you for all joining us today. Again, just final for everybody that's in the atrium. We have some seats up here if you want to take a seat and enjoy your lunch, but we're going to go ahead and get started with our guest speaker here today. My name is Charles Hill. I'm the Director of Community Outreach here at Rev 1, so we're excited about having you out here. How many first-timers we got here today? How many first time to the building? Raise them high, raise them high. Thank you for joining us. We do these monthly to feature founders that we have within our portfolio companies and things like that. For your first-time people coming out, we will actually be doing tours of the building afterwards, so looking forward to that. If you want to hang around, as soon as we get done, Andrea and a couple other people will be doing some tours that we have of the building if you want to learn a little bit more. So we're excited about that. So we're without further ado, I don't want to hold you up too long. We're going to get kicked off so we can get you out of here and respect your time to get you out of here a little bit before 1 o'clock as we get started. So I will introduce our Executive Vice President of Investment Funds. Did I get that right? That was a mouthful. If y'all can say that back, you get a prize at the end. But Mr. Ryan Helon, and again, thanks Al for coming in and helping us out with this program. But you kick it away.
All right. Thanks everyone for being here this afternoon. It's my sincere pleasure to have the opportunity to interview Al Hawkins. Al is one of the entrepreneurs that we work with at Rev 1. We've had the pleasure of working with Al since 2014. In late 2014, we made our first investment in the company and have been able to support the company through some subsequent financing rounds as well. But today we'll hear the story from Al about Milo Biotechnology, a very exciting gene therapy company that's bringing a breakthrough cure for muscular dystrophy to market. So without further ado, we'll get started. Al, tell us a little bit about what is Milo Biotechnology.
So Milo is a biotechnology company, as you might divine. It was spun out of Nationwide Children's Hospital, the great local Nationwide Children's Hospital, in 2012. So we've been at this about 5 years now. It's a single asset, so it's basically a single drug. And what the drug does is it makes muscle stronger. So it makes it the muscle cells bigger, it makes the muscle function better, it makes it less inflamed, and that's all important for muscular dystrophies of all kinds. So muscular dystrophies are progressive muscle wasting diseases. There's a whole range of those muscular dystrophies of all different causes, but they're kind of united by severe muscle wasting. So our therapy, which is injected into the leg muscles of patients, although we could also inject it into their veins for a systemic treatment, it aims to retard the progression of muscular dystrophy or hopefully improve their function over time.
Sounds great, Al. So I want to definitely get into a little more of how much progress you and the company have made and Nationwide Children's have made advancing the development of the treatment. But first, let's take a step back. What were you doing back in 2012 before starting Milo? And then tell us a little bit about the origin story. How did you come to identify the asset, partner with Nationwide Children's, partner up with Brian Casper, your technical co-founder and researcher at Nationwide Children's? So how did it all come together?
I think the story probably, for me anyway, goes back, the technology goes back to 2005, 2006 at Nationwide Children's. So they were developing that for a long period of time. Dr. Brian Caspar, whom you just mentioned, Dr. Jerry Mendel there, who were two of the best kind of known researchers in the muscular dystrophy space. They had been testing it probably 2005 through 2011, which is the time that I became involved. But my orientation on the program, my first exposure to it was when I was still in Boston. So I was the venture fund manager at Boston University there, and was kind of tired of doing that, I guess, and wanted to do my own company, and started focusing on therapies for muscular dystrophy. So I thought that space was really ripe for startup development. Because there were no at that time approved therapies for those diseases, really severe disease burden, and then also there were a lot of disease foundations that were getting involved in funding these startups and these programs that were moving into clinical trials. So I really focused on that space and started looking kind of around the world for the best projects in muscular dystrophy. So going to conferences all over, searching for those projects that weren't yet licensed to industry. Of course, a lot of them were already at pharmaceutical companies. And then I was very fortunate to be recruited to Cleveland. I'm from Cleveland originally, so it was a boomerang situation to be what they called a CEO in residence at BioEnterprise up in Cleveland. And that was the greatest job. Like, the job was basically, they paid me to start companies for myself. Of course I'm going to say yes to that, and had already been looking at assets in muscular dystrophy. Was very fortunate to find the resources at NCH, just 2.5 hours away down 71, and loved the team, loved the resources that they have there in Nationwide Children's. A GMP production facility, a regulatory capacity, certainly the clinical capabilities. So it seemed like an ideal situation to kind of bolt a virtual startup onto all those pre-existing resources, and fund it primarily with foundation resources, with those patient-driven, parent-driven resources that were available. So the concept really was to advance the programs into to what we call clinical proof of concept, basically determine whether or not this is safe and looks effective in humans. It does so far, as of right now. And then we thought we'd have options, whether that's raising more funding to go to later stages of development, or whether that's, we could be acquired. So that's kind of been a 5-year process, a close partnership with Nationwide Children's Hospital along the way, where really the vast majority of the work's been done.
That's fantastic. You hit on a few different themes that I want to dig a little bit deeper into. So maybe firstly, talk a little about the partnership with Nationwide Children's and how that's enabled you to really organize the company. You mentioned the term kind of a virtual company. So in terms of the capabilities you've developed and the pieces of Milo's development that you're leading versus, what and how you're partnering, with Nationwide Children's Hospital to advance the company as well.
Yeah, great question. So NCH has so many resources, again, for developing these therapies, kind of from animal proof of concept in a mouse to early human proof of concept. So they've got the manufacturing, the regulatory, as I mentioned, and it made perfect sense for NCH to be kind of a one-stop shop for all those things because of the familiarity with the technology and the great expertise there. And then, my role has been more just purely on the business side, really, in translating that science for business audiences in a lot of cases. So fundraising, either whether that's foundation, grant, or private equity. Talking to strategic partners, big pharma companies or big biotech companies that might want to or might not want to partner with us. And then bringing together, so we're a virtual company, we've got a lot of great consultants. We've got great consultants in kind of every domain. And bringing those people together and getting those people excited and helping bring outside perspectives, from other clinicians around the world, other regulatory consultants, manufacturing consultants, because what we have to do next is kind of an order of magnitude greater and harder than what we've done to date, which is if we want to move this into pivotal studies, much bigger studies in a multi-center setting. So really the last year and a half, we've been laying the groundwork for that. And that's what I've been doing, is building those networks of funding, of experts that will help us go to that next stage.
Excellent. So you mentioned the funding, some of the funding coming from foundations, and certainly a company like Milo is having a very big impact and providing some pretty significant societal benefits by bringing, a breakthrough therapy to market, for a really debilitating disease that, affects children. Talk a little bit about, how the foundations have worked with Milo and how that's been a key source of funding, because that's complex and nuanced in terms of their motivations, why they're supporting a project like this, and how you liaise with them versus, traditional financial investors.
Yeah, so we've had a number of foundation funders, both to Milo directly, and then also the hospital had secured some foundation funding for the programs, previously too. And I always think that foundations, and usually the foundations I'm talking about here, with some exceptions, they're not like giant professionally managed foundations like you might understand, like the United Way. A lot of these are parents, who have a child with, let's say, Duchenne muscular dystrophy, or who had a child with Duchenne muscular dystrophy, very sadly, who are motivated to do whatever they can to find a cure, basically. And so that they have a sense of urgency that you don't see a lot in drug development, and I really appreciate that sense of urgency. I think that that orientation, the parents and patients orientation, is actually very well aligned with the startup orientation. Because look, as startups, we don't have a lot of money or a lot of time or anything like that, and all we really want to do, my focus is developing something, that's going to be beneficial to patients. And if it is, the other things will come, probably. The financial success or the ability to raise resources and that sort of thing comes with showing that you can have a benefit for patients. So I feel like all those things are really well aligned between foundations and startups. The other side of that coin, probably is that drug development by its nature is highly regulated. It's slow, it's iterative, like you have a lot of failures and you have to start again. And there's just a very high failure rate. And the foundations, I mentioned their urgency that they have. It's not always compatible with the drug development system and the regulatory system that we work in. And that's been the challenge. That's something I've learned, to try to set expectations early. That balance between some promise for a therapy, but also setting proper expectations, because things go wrong all the time in drug development. Things always take longer than we project they're going to.
Great. So you talk about the expectations in terms of seeing progress with the foundations that have partnered with Milo and Nationwide Children's Hospital. So talk a little about, maybe context first. You mentioned there are many different types of muscular dystrophies. So, and each could respond to very different therapies. So Milo is focused on 3 specific types. So maybe talk a little about the 3 types and the progress that you and the company in Nationwide Children's have made in advancing those therapies through the clinic, because that's, I think, a really impressive part of the Milo story in terms of just how far along the company has gotten in a very short amount of time with a fairly limited amount of capital.
Yeah, thanks. So really, to start, Milo was fortunate that the technology was at a pretty advanced stage when we first licensed it in 2012. So it was just entering clinical studies at that point in time, and that's for an academic project. The academic therapeutic projects that I typically see are at the animal proof of concept stages, and they've shown that something works in a mouse. But this was further along to begin with. So the studies have been in 3, as you mentioned, 3 different muscular dystrophy populations. One is probably the best known and the most recent population that we've been in is Duchenne muscular dystrophy. So that's a severe childhood onset genetic disease. It is deadly almost always in these boys. It only occurs in boys. A very, very sad and unfortunate disease with severe cardiac impairments, as well as the skeletal muscle impairments that we're trying to address. So there, we're going to be part of a solution, with other therapies that might improve, like cardiac function, might cause them to produce a protein called dystrophin that they're missing. But we're hoping to be someday part of that solution. And then the next population, which was actually one of the first populations we went into, but it's easier to explain DMD first and then explain this population, which is Becker muscular dystrophy. This is also a rare muscular dystrophy caused by a lack of the same protein as Duchenne muscular dystrophy, but these patients produce a little bit more of that protein, and so they live much longer. They don't have the same cardiac muscle or diaphragm muscle defects that a Duchenne patient might have, and their primary disability is the inability to walk after a certain point in time. So they're cane or wheelchair bound very early. And in there, we've been able to show that the drug looks safe, so we haven't had any adverse events in this population, and that the patients, on average, are walking further 2 years later than they were when they were injected. So our drug is a one-time injection. That's the gene therapy nature of things. It's not something you take daily or monthly. It's a one-time injection, and then you hope to see sustained function or improved function over time. So those Becker muscular dystrophy patients are walking further than they were at baseline, which you would not expect. That's a good result. And then our final population is called inclusion body myositis. a very different, I'm going to call it IBM from now on. It's a very different population. It's an adult onset myopathy. These patients are ages 50 to 70, roughly, when they're diagnosed. And there again, and the investigators at Nationwide Children's just last month published a paper showing that the drug is safe, or it seems to be safe in that population, and all of those patients are walking further than they were at baseline. So even in the absence of disease, you wouldn't really expect patients age, in their 50s to 70s to be walking further over a 2-year period or a 1-year period or whatever that is. So we feel like we've shown in 18 patients in total that the drug looks to be safe, and we're getting indications that it might be effective in a couple of these populations. And then the next step is proving that out in a larger pivotal study. That's that order of magnitude jump that we need to make.
Great. So, I think for those who aren't familiar with the drug development process, for a company to have advanced to this stage is, very substantial and not very common for early stage companies to be able to develop at this pace as Milo has. I think it's really a testament to Al and Nationwide Children's, proficiency and work around this. So the impact this is having and could have with these patient populations is nothing short of life-changing. So how do you put words to that? How do you think about, kind of the responsibility associated with, managing a company that could have this kind of profound impact on patients?
Yeah, no, we hope it will, right? That's the goal. And it's still early days, so it's not certain, but it's nice, and thanks to the introduction that you made, I talked to a patient yesterday that was injected with our therapy, who seems like his life has improved, as a result of that, and I get probably an email every other day, a new email every other day from a patient in one of those 3 populations or a parent of a patient in one of those 3 populations. And so it's, I think it's my role, just because Milo is like small and there's just a couple of us, right? There aren't a lot of layers of hierarchy, right? We're much more on the front lines with the patients and the parents and that sort of thing. So it's a different orientation as compared to like big pharma is to patients and parents and that sort of thing. And it does feel like sometimes it does feel like more of a responsibility, but I really enjoy it, because it's a reminder of why we do. And the patients, the parents, they're ultimately very reasonable, and they understand, how the process this needs to go through, and usually just like happy to have a dialogue of any kind, with us. So that aspect's been great. I love that. And we, Abiona Therapeutics, which is another company that I co-founded a couple years ago, out of Nationwide Children's Hospital. Again, that was another front lines with the Disease Foundation's kind of project. And just really enjoyed that interface. Again, I think the foundations and the startups are really well aligned in this kind of ecosystem.
Excellent. So, Al, one thing I wanted to touch on was, we talked a little bit about working with an organization like Nationwide Children's, which has been very supportive for the successful development of Milo thus far. But there's also, kind of a key partnership in Milo with you and Brian Kaspar. So talk a little about, your work with Brian, how, that relationship, was built, how it works today, and how you partner with him as a co-founder that also is a prominent gene therapy researcher and involved with other projects, but also obviously heavily committed to Milo.
It's been fantastic, basically. I mean, that's the shorthand. Brian is a dream kind of scientific co-founder, and I'd worked with scientists, entrepreneurs in a lot of different settings in Madison, Wisconsin, where I did similar work, in Boston, obviously spinning a lot of companies out of BU, and he's like 99th percentile in his ability to not just be a great researcher, but translate that into clinical practice and translate that into what the drug development steps are needed, to take things forward, and not just be a very intelligent person, which all scientists at that level are, but have a high level of emotional intelligence too, which is kind of rare at this interface like that. So that interaction has been great. He's been the company clearly would not exist without him, obviously. And really probably actually our greatest asset is his involvement, which it's been great.
Are there any pieces of advice you would provide to entrepreneurs seeking to work effectively, with principal investigators at research institutions? What can an entrepreneur do to maximize the value of that relationship, to build that relationship effectively and see the kind of benefits, or lay the foundation to see the kind of benefits that you've been able to realize?
Yeah, no, I think involving them, and I guess the other thing to say, the nice thing is that our decision making is, again, very streamlined at Milo. Like, if Brian wants to do something and I want to do something, we can do it. That's the nice thing, because we haven't taken a lot of venture capital at this point in time, and so that's nice too. In terms of advice for entrepreneurs, and I guess it extends to not just like partnering with researchers. It has to do with the whole approach and relationship with research institutions, I think, too. So I mentioned before that I had an idea of what I wanted to do. I wanted to work in muscular dystrophy to start out. I think that approach is more credible maybe than going to like an Ohio State or Nationwide Children's Hospital and saying, hey, I'm here, what do you have? Like, I live here too. Really having a goal in mind of what technologies you're looking for. And then the other thing that does is, especially for me, I'm trained as a business person, not a science person. Like, I speak pidgin science, I parrot back things that other people have said at this point in time. But having a little bit of depth of knowledge in a space and learning that space is really valuable, because it builds your credibility with those researchers in that space. And eventually, sometimes I do know what I'm talking about, eventually, 6 years down the road, that sort of thing. And so that getting to know, I guess what I'm saying is getting to know their world a little better is valuable. I think it helps build the kind of that rapport. And for me, I think it had helped because I had worked in research. I'd worked side by side with or inside of research institutions for so long, so I kind of understood the system. The political pressures from one side or another, the funding environment, for grants and that sort of thing, which drives a lot of decision making and that sort of thing within research institutions. So those kinds of that focus on a space and understanding, who you're talking to. For the most part, these researchers, they're not going to quit their day job to become an entrepreneur, right? They're going to remain in their lab, and they're super busy, doing that. And so, you don't waste their time. You bring them in on big decisions, that sort of thing, and understand the pressures they're under, because like Brian's way busier than I am, So I say sometimes that like my job is to, not waste his time, right? So that's kind of how I think about, developing that relationship over time.
Excellent. So in addition, we talked a lot about the clinical development of Milo, and given that it's a company that has to navigate through the clinical pathway before it could bring the product to market, the treatment to market, you're also at the same time building a business. And you're doing that in this pretty unique context. But talk a little about the work you're doing to really build the business of Milo against the backdrop of the development of these therapies, and how you're positioning the company, for financing, for success, for partnerships with industry, to actually make it not just an exciting potential cure, but also a successful business.
Yeah, so that's an iterative process, and it's one that's ongoing for us. It mostly is again about my role is translating science for lay audiences. That's kind of what I do very often, or for very educated audiences that like venture capitalists who have to know 500 different spaces, right? And they might have forgotten about what Becker muscular dystrophy is, for instance. So that's a lot of what I do, is making the science tangible, and then the other aspects of it, I think, are bringing it. It's not dissimilar from what you do from any other kind of business, like trying to learn from your customers and what your customers want. So our customers, we're a long ways from the market. But who are our ultimate customers? They're the patients and the parents that I've talked about a lot already, but also the clinicians. So neurologists are prescribing doctors in this space. So we did a survey last year of 30 different neurologists kind of around the country to to understand the real needs in this these spaces, present our clinical data and have them have them opine on that and tell us what they think, and whether this will be widely prescribed if it's translated to a bigger study, and then taking those perspectives and again synthesizing those, distilling those for an investor audience again. Bringing together, like Ryan, we don't have a lot of capital, right? So bringing together kind of the best people in the world on a shoestring, getting them excited about these consultants who have worked in prominent organizations in our space, getting them excited about the program so that they want to do it for almost nothing, right? They want to work with it for almost that kind of putting all those pieces together. And then, the stage that I mentioned that we're coming up on is, if we're fortunate enough to raise significantly more funding, then those things that were kind of loose, that were kind of floating around us, the consultant relationships, the clinician relationships, then we can cement those a little bit more because we've got the financing to do it. But as of right now, up until now, it's been kind of just arranging different partners, around the opportunity, getting them excited about the opportunity, and then translating that opportunity for investors.
Thank you. So you have raised capital from traditional financing sources. So as a life science entrepreneur, talk a little about engaging with the investor community, the institutional investor community, the angel investor community. What do you think helped you be successful in raising money to date, and also just managing those investor relations successfully as you build the company?
Well, one of our best investor relationship is right here, I think, in Rev 1, of course. That's been great. I mean, I think so Milo's received funding from a number of in-state sources here, from the Cuyahoga County Loan Fund initially, which we were really appreciative of. That was $100,000 before the company was really ever formed. So very high risk capital there. From Jumpstart up in Cleveland, they were early investors. Then from Rev 1, and then from Rev 1 again, and then from OTAF, from the Ohio Tech Angel Fund here. And so those relationships have all been very great, supportive. I think what I've been impressed by is the appropriate amount of risk taking that goes on, because these are ultimately long shot therapies, right? I believe they deserve a chance. But I think organizations like Rev 1 were willing to go out on a limb for these therapies, and take some, again, appropriate risk, but take some risk where others may not have. Others may have said this is too early, or you need to solve this, and this. So I'm just very grateful for the resources that we've had so far and the relationships we've had so far. In terms of managing them, I guess my thing is I don't really have much of a filter. So I'm just completely transparent, right? And just say what's going on, right? And I think that probably surprises some audiences at first, because they're more accustomed to kind of a sales approach to investor relations or trying to raise capital. But once one gets accustomed to it, I think it's appreciated. It's appreciated, that kind of rapport. So that's what I try to do, is just be transparent with what's going on, and then you don't have any bad surprises. You don't have anything lurking in the back of your mind, keeping you up at night, that sort of thing, down the road.
So one of my things that I enjoyed as I got to know Al through the due diligence was, how there was sort of an increasing, trust in that interaction as we went through due diligence. And one thing I want Al to talk a little about that I thought was really interesting is we were looking at the cap table, and you expect to see the founders having significant ownership, but there was one small investor that I was like, who is this? It had an acronym, and I said, Al, who is this? They didn't put any money into Milo, so how did they get this ownership? What's going on? So he explained this to me, and I'll let him talk a little bit about how he handled an investor in a prior venture that didn't work out, and what he did for that investor in connection with his new project. So,
all right, yeah. I've been a biotech entrepreneur for a long time, like 18, 20 years, something like that, in different settings again, and that's what I enjoy doing. But these don't always work. These companies, right? As I mentioned before, there's a high risk of failure. So, when I was in Madison, I had co-founded a company. We raised very little capital, though. We raised, I think, less than $100,000 in capital. But it didn't go anywhere. We licensed technologies from University of Wisconsin, University of Minnesota. I was in my probably mid-20s when we did this. It didn't go anywhere. Not to any of our faults, the science just didn't pan out, basically, and it didn't merit additional investment. But those investors that put in that like $92,000 or whatever it was, I kind of felt like they were investing more in me and my business partner than they were. I don't think they really believed in the technology that much. I think it was maybe pity money or something like that. But that was really valuable. That was like our first, the first company that I had done, and so I just kind of remembered that, and felt. I don't know if I felt bad, but of course I wanted that to work out. So yeah, when Milo was founded, we dealt them in for those guys that had invested and women who'd invested before in the previous company, gave them a little bit of equity, as kind of a token that thanks for what you did back then, for me anyway. That's what I thought.
So for the entrepreneurs in the audience, investors are always looking for these data points from which they can attempt to extrapolate from. So when you see sort of thoughtfulness around how an entrepreneur engages with their investors, even when things don't go well, it's easy for everyone if it works. Then the pie is big, there's plenty of pie to go around, everyone feels great. But when things don't work out and it comes down to, okay, how do we make the best of a bad situation? I think that's where people's true character shows. And that small anecdote from Al, again, just sort of build upon a track record of trust that he was establishing with Rev 1 and me working on the due diligence, and that really does go a long way. So I think it's an important lesson that thinking of how you're treating your investors, even when things don't work out, is really key.
And I'm hoping we don't have to do the same thing with you guys downstream.
As am I. So Al, let's shift gears a little bit and talk just a little bit more about kind of your journey as an entrepreneur. So you mentioned this is what you always wanted to do, but before we were getting started, you were telling me about your first professional endeavor. So maybe talk a little about, because that's kind of a funny story, what you originally did professionally and then how you made this transition to working in the life science field and becoming an entrepreneur there.
Yeah. Well, so sometimes the things that you don't want to do are more formative experiences than the things you do want to do. And so I was telling Ryan an anecdote about the time that I was right out of college. I was a disability claims adjuster at an insurance company. And that was the point in time. I won't tell that specific anecdote, but that was the time that I realized that I just wasn't cut out for big company work. Like I was not a fit. And I think I'd probably gotten a B- average in college, and that was the time that I realized wow, I really need to turn this around. Because I don't like that, and that environment's not suited for me. And so. I escaped to graduate school, which is a good place to escape, you young people, when you don't like what you're doing. Then in graduate school, started working. I went really young because I wanted to escape. I started working with all these professors out of University of Wisconsin-Madison who were developing new drugs, new diagnostics, new medical devices, that sort of thing. And I was getting my MBA, and the other options were, no issues with these careers, but like being a brand manager for Lunchables or something like that. And that is true. And of course, Lunchables would have paid more, but I couldn't. I wanted to do something working with people I really enjoyed working with and who wanted to make a difference, because all these professors. They had a vision that included patients, in their lives. That's kind of rare. So I was kind of smitten with that. I worked 5 years. My friend and I started a consulting firm, and then the biotech company that we just talked about a minute ago. Made no money. I think the most I made in any year during that period was like $22,000, something like that. But we had a great time. We had the best time learning about all these technologies, got great experience, that sort of thing. Then escaped to graduate school again in Boston. Again, good place to escape. And then kind of found more of a stride with the translation of university technologies after my second graduate school experience. And by that time, I kind of I understood the system. I had made no money doing it, but I understood, that was good experience. It was like part of my 10,000 hours is kind of how I see it, that I got early on there. So that was my path, and I think I'm thankful for the insurance company experience because it sent me off, and if I had been promoted, if I was good at that at all, that probably would have been a very bad thing for me. That worked out.
You mentioned sort of the top-down approach you had to knowing you wanted to work on muscular dystrophy-related therapy. So how did you arrive at that? What was sort of your process of going from wanting to work on translation of research to commercialization? How did you settle on muscular dystrophy, and what was sort of your thought process of defining that?
It was, that process probably started in 2008, 2009, and many of you might remember that financial crisis that happened around that time. Like venture capital ceased to exist, especially for new therapeutic projects. And the only really things that were getting funded at that point in time were like healthcare, IT, kind of shorter term, very meritorious kind of projects, but shorter term, more tangible, closer to sales kinds of projects. And I guess I was trying to think differently, because at that point in time I didn't have any real expertise in any domain, but I was trying to think differently and think about, so this isn't a good climate to raise financing in. Let's look 5 years down the road. Let's look 10 years down the road. Let's set this aside and think about what's going to matter downstream. And the muscular dystrophy space was nice, again, because there was a great need. There were all these foundation funding sources, so you didn't necessarily need the venture capital to get to your human proof of concept that I talked about earlier. So that was an appealing, that was kind of an appealing combination of things. And then also the gene therapy aspect of the technology, which we haven't talked about that much. But going back to 2011, 2010, those kinds of approaches were very much not in vogue. Okay, it was small molecules and antibody approaches were really what was favored, and mostly still are. But I think I was probably I didn't know what I didn't know, or what I should have known, to be afraid of the gene therapy approaches, because I just saw great data. I just saw like this animal data and small and large animal data that Brian Kaspar and Jerry Mendel were generating, and having seen all the other data in the space, or a lot of the other data in the space, I was like, looks great. I mean, this looks great. Never mind that it's a biologic that's really hard to produce and that everyone's wary of and that sort of thing. And so kind of thought about what's going to matter to patients 5, 10 years down the line was my thought process. Never mind, what pharma might want today or what a financing partner might want today. Because at that point in time, 2010, nobody wanted anything in biotech, So I felt like I was forced to think kind of years down the road, and then that kind of channeled, the types of things that interested me, I guess.
So if you think about your accumulated knowledge over the last 5 years, building Milo, what have been kind of the top 2 or 3 things you've learned over that period that if only you'd have known in 2012, you could have avoided, maybe some less efficient paths?
Probably the toughest. I think I only have one, Ryan. It's like big in my brain right now. So we were fortunate to have some interest from large biotech, large pharma companies, going back to like 2015 when the first clinical results were published, and we were more virtual than we are now, if that's even possible at that point in time. And had what seemed like a really good deal with a biggish pharma company that took 8 or 9 months to play out, at which time we weren't allowed to talk to other partners. It's called exclusivity. You have to like go through their process and only work with them. And 2 things there. Two things I learned there. One, it's especially when you're operating in a virtual environment, it's really good to have professional help. It doesn't matter, like the percentages you might give up. In our space, in the biotech space, the tens, hundreds of thousands of dollars you might give up for that kind of help. But so I would have hired an investment bank for that interaction, and that's the lesson I learned, and we have subsequently done that. Wish we had an investment bank during that process to kind of light a fire under the pharma partners. And then, I think my second learning from that miserable in the end experience was it still hurts, was that no matter, so I've been talking about this through this time, I've been talking about small organizations, and those are the organizations I know where I exercise some influence over those organizations. And I'm very accustomed to exercising influence over tiny, tiny organizations. Well, organizations that buy you and that want to partner with you in a biotech or otherwise sense, those executives, whether they be even the CEO, don't exercise a lot of control over what goes on there. And any change in the winds, any change in the stock price, anything, a clinical failure you think is unrelated to you, anything can change what that relationship you think you've built with a strategic partner, and it's not done until it's done, right? And so I think I've become more cynical in that whole process. And it's not that the employees of these companies' hearts aren't in the right place, because they believe they want to do the deal, but it's just that they can't sometimes. You know, just the politics around an organization like that are so much more complex than I can even imagine or want to even think about. And so, I think more about parallel tracking things now. My assumption, again, it's cynical, but my assumption is kind of from a financing and a partnering standpoint that nothing will come to fruition. And then I will be happily surprised at some point in time, like do everything in parallel, assume nothing's going to work, and I would love to be happily surprised at some point in time.
So one thing I want to make sure you talked about, because Ohio hasn't built a large number of large, successful life science companies, which needs to change. What has been your experience engaging with institutional investors, and what's their reaction to, I'm building this company in Ohio with a great research institution partner? Have you gotten objections? How have you overcome those objections? What do you think about building this company in Ohio? You've clearly chosen to do that.
Yeah, it's non-traditional. Like I often open my calls with because they're used to, these investors from the coast are used to talking to companies in San Francisco and Boston, basically, maybe New York, and so I always reference the fact basically that of course we're coming from Cleveland, that they're not expecting that at all, and I think it's surprising, right? I think what's helped is actually Nationwide's recent track record of success with other companies. So with Avexis, which Brian Casper was a co-founder and CSO of, which has been a huge success as a public market company. So all those investors know that story very well. And then the Abeona story that I was a co-founder of, that we spun out, that's a public company now too, that's helped a lot too. So it's helped that at least two of the three companies that early on in gene therapy that spun out a Nationwide Children's Hospital, these investors recognize. So that system is good. And Dr. Mendel is one of the best known people in the space as a clinician. So in one sense, we may be in what they perceive as a biotech backwater. No offense, but I'm happy here, right? But the specific knowledge that's accumulated here and that we've accumulated around Milo as a consultant base, I think tempers that quite a bit. So it's less of an issue. And the other thing is that they understand very well that these companies are largely virtual. That even the mid-sized now public gene therapy companies, they may be headquartered in, let's say, Texas, but they've got employees in New York, Boston, San Francisco, because that's where those people live and they want to stay there. And so I think those investors understand that, more and more. And I mean, the last part of it is, I'll get on a plane anytime to go see somebody. You have to be flexible with that. So, probably, if we build a bigger company that's kind of venture backed, we may not have the board meetings here because they don't want to travel from the coast. I'll get on a plane. That kind of concession. But I haven't gotten really much pushback from it because they just kind of understand the nature of the evolution of these companies.
That's great. So one more question, Al, before we turn it over to the audience. So what can you say about the next steps for Milo? What's the next milestone? What's the next progress point that you're hoping to drive the company toward?
So we continue to get clinical data from the studies that are already funded, and those are nice little inflection points along the way while we're raising funds. But our next big step is producing enough drug, enough of our drug to conduct larger pivotal trials. And in our space, that is no mean feat. That's like a tough thing, and a thing that a lot of these gene therapy companies kind of hit the rocks doing. So that's really what I'm focused on, is securing the funding for that big drug production that is scalable. Right, to take what's been done in the research labs and scale it for large pivotal studies for commercial scale distribution, and then setting the groundwork shortly thereafter. We're already setting the groundwork for that, for the larger pivotal trial operations that we're going to have to do. So that is, bringing together the funding for those two activities, the drug manufacturing and the trials, is the next step. And then, if we're so lucky to get through that gauntlet, which is a lot, the drug, I think, could be approved in one or more indications in about 4 years. So that gives you an idea of the development timeline here. Like, to a lot of you who have experience with IT companies and other industries, that probably sounds like a long time. Well, we're pretty close. We're pretty close to market at 4 years. And recall at the outset, I said that this work started 2005, 2006, something like that. So we're already more than 10 years in. That's just the nature of it. There's a lot to do and a lot of capital that needs to go into it. So that's what's next.
Awesome. That's exciting progress and just a fantastic outlook for the company. So I want to make sure folks in our audience have a chance to ask. So I know Andrea and Shannon have microphones in case there's any questions.
Hey, Al. Thanks for boomeranging back into Ohio. So, but actually, my question is for Ryan. Ryan, can you explain a little bit the co-investment that you all did at Rev 1 together with Jumpstart? Because those are two regional entities. Jumpstart, for those in the room, it's up in Cleveland. And I think it was awesome that two of you came together to invest into one company, but that is rare. Can you kind of share a little insight into how that happened? And
was that the first time? Was that the first time that's
It was. It was the first time that we partnered with Jumpstart on a project. So our rationalization for that was, so Al lives in Cleveland. That's okay. I'm a Cavs fan. I grew up in Akron. But the research, Brian Kaspar, the manufacturing capability, the clinical trials, all that work was being done at Nationwide Children's. Nationwide Children's, for those who don't know, is a very critical partner of Rev 1 Ventures. So that was sort of the justification that this truly was a company that really cut across that 100-mile swath of Interstate 71. And we were comfortable, Third Frontier was comfortable, Jumpstart obviously was comfortable for us to work together on the project.
Hello. Hi, I'm Mary Uhas. I'm an Associate Vice President in the Office of Research at The Ohio State University and Professor of Engineering. How many women have you worked with over the years, either as a co-lead or co-founder, as the primary investigator of any of these companies?
I'm thinking. Sorry, I'm thinking. Probably 8 to 10 out of 50 or so companies. So smallish number, but yeah.
Just curious, I don't know if you know yet, for your pivotal trial, are you planning on doing it in more than one indication, or are you going to do it in BMD and IBM, or?
Yeah, thanks, Louise. We're planning to go forward in BMD and IBM kind of concurrently, and there's obviously economies of scale in doing that. The drug's the same, so we can produce the drug in one big batch, and then we've got economies of scale in clinical trial ops too, because it's neurology centers. It probably won't be a lot of centers, probably 5 or 6 in total, to treat both those patient populations. Yep. Define. BMD, so Louise asked, I'm sorry, now I'm translating this whole thing. All right, I'll break it down. Thanks, Wayne. So we're going to go forward in 2 patient populations concurrently. That's our plan, right? They're patient populations we treated before, Becker muscular dystrophy and inclusion body myositis, that IBM that I was talking about before. And the goal would be to treat those patient populations concurrently in trials that would be what we call pivotal trials that would be eligible for registration, that we could, at the conclusion of those, if the data looks good, if it looks safe and effective, we could get a drug approval for one or both of those indications. So that's what we're trying to, as the venture investors say, have 2 shots on goal. Thanks, Wayne.
So, a bit of a follow-up question from one of the ones that Brian asked. Is actually one of your challenges, given the structure and the approach you've taken with Milo, that you're not raising enough money to interest a lot of investors?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, that's totally true. That's and when I give first-time investor pitches, we'll go through the science and the clinical development, that sort of thing, and they're adequately impressed, whatever, but they enjoy it. They enjoy this part of the presentation, but that is the part where, and I think it's not laughing at us. I think it's laughing like wow, like that's really cool that you did that. But we get some chuckles when we get to how much we've raised to date, because most companies to be at this stage would have raised $20-50 million, maybe more, right, to get to this stage. And it is, I think it is in a sense, like I'm glad we didn't, but it is in a way a detriment, because raising money begets more money. It's just a fact. And it's validation of investors that they work with all the time and that sort of thing. And so in some cases we're pretty grown up from a data standpoint, but we're kind of babies with regard to the fundraising sort of thing. So when we take our first big institutional round, if we do, we'll probably suffer a little bit on the valuation side because we don't have that track record of building that up. I'm sure. Great question.
What are you going to do after Milo?
Great question. I try not to think that far ahead, right? Because that's bad news. But more of this. I love this. Like, I absolutely love it. Like, I want to do. I feel like I've got another 20-some years, like, of actively doing it, and I don't. I'm just hungry for doing more. I really, really enjoy it and want to, apply the things that I've learned to date into more and more and more and more. Because it's just fun,
Kind of a follow-up question to that. You've had other businesses. How do you balance? Are you currently working on a few different businesses, or how do you balance that?
Great question. So right now I'm only working on one. It's such a relief. And it's been that way for about the last 2 years, which is. But in the past, yes, I was a principal. I was VP of Business Development and one of the early employees of a venture fund called Biomotive, which is up in Cleveland and kind of all over. I was founder and CEO of Milo, and I was founder and chairman of Abiona, the other company that we talked about. That was too much at once, and it was really challenging. And I sometimes would be like, okay, for this call, I am this person, that sort of thing. That's challenging. And then the other challenge is not just the actual conflict of commitment, not just the actual time in the day, it's perceived conflict of commitment. So these investors that put significant capital into companies, they don't want entrepreneurs doing 3-4 things, diversifying, that sort of thing, which is a rational thing to do, but they want commitment. And that's a challenge for an entrepreneur in an industry where the average incubation time for one of these companies, before you really know, if you're going to be able to sell or it's going to fail or what, is probably 5, maybe 7 years. So if you're all in for those 5 or 7 years, and then it succeeds or it fails or whatever, you just don't have a lot of time in your life to do a lot of these companies. So it's a tension that I felt before. I'm feeling like, when you asked that question, I was like, just one, and that feels really good right now. It's like a relief to be concentrated on this one thing, so I know who I am day to day. But that's the challenge.
This is a question for Al. This is more of a medical-based question than a business question. How flexible is this drug exactly? Like,
So what other things could it be used for? Yeah. So I mentioned that I get probably an email every other day from a patient in one of these three populations, and that's about right. And then probably once a month I get an email from someone who's like, Follistatin, when can I get it? How much? You know, like from somebody who wants it for a weight training kind of like thing, because it is broadly applicable. So, yeah, you could Lance Armstrong it probably if you wanted to. For more practical, maybe nearer term applications, more ethical applications, what's called sarcopenia, which is age-related wasting, which it's not a disease, it's just what happens to all of us, eventually. That's an application that the pharma companies are interested in, for instance. Cancer treatment-related wasting is another application. So it's really, really, really broadly applicable. Good question. Some of the uses could be sketchy. Yeah.
Well, I just remember the first investor presentation I had with Al in early 2014. The cover page was the most muscular cow you've ever seen in your life. It was just ripped, and I was like, what is this?
And the former, I mentioned Cuyahoga County funded us early on. The former Cuyahoga County executive, Ed Fitzgerald, upon the signing, it wasn't much of a ceremony, I'm sure, when he signed the thing, he said, well, if nothing else, we've got an army of super monkeys.
Do you have plans to expand the research on other conditions other than muscular dystrophy?
Probably not for us. The thing about the muscular dystrophies is because they're relatively rare and relatively severe, that guides the size of trials and the duration of trials that we have to do. So as a startup company, those trials are easier to manage, for those severe muscular dystrophies. If we licensed it to a partner, if we worked with a bigger company, I can imagine them going into like sarcopenia, the age-related wasting that I mentioned, but not for us. If we continue in other indications, it'll be more rare muscular dystrophies kind of working that way.
We'll take one more question. Okay, I have one, if not. So you work in such an emotional realm, right, with children that are affected, loved ones, and you said that you get personal emails all the time asking to utilize this technology. So with that in mind, what's the emotional toll personally on you and your team working in this field?
For me, it's not. It's energizing, if anything. Because the people that I interact with are eminently reasonable, and we think of them as patients, but they've got like senses of humor, and like other lives, like believe it or not, and so interacting with them on a number of levels like that. It doesn't take a toll like once you realize that they're just people, right? And I think I don't want to speak for Brian Casper, but I think he does that a lot in his work outside of Milo, for sure. The work at Nationwide Children's Hospital, a lot of direct connection to patients. In Avexis, a lot of direct connection to patients. And I think it inspires him. I think it gives him a lot of energy, and that's why he does what he does. So I think it's as far as I'm concerned, it's 100% positive, really.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Al, and thank you so much, Ryan, for being a great moderator today. We really enjoyed hearing your story, the hurdles that you faced, different obstacles, as well as answering all of our questions. So if we can give them both a big round of applause for being here today.